Welcome to the Financial Aspects of Business Contracts class. We spent the last 3 weeks learning about financial information using the Finance and Accounting textbook. Now we will cover cost and pricing principles and switch to the Guide to Contract Pricing textbook by John Edward Murphy. Here we will talk about basic pricing policy and concepts, revisit the definition of profit, which we learned earlier as the difference between revenues and expenses. We will also go over the meaning of terms like cost and price, which are often used interchangeably. What is meant by full and open competition? What is a fair and reasonable price? From there, we will go into various solicitation and contracting methods. If you have taken the Principles of Business Contracts class with me, this would be a refresher. However, the difference will be the alignment with the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or FAR. We will close out the module with pricing analysis and the various ways and techniques to perform one. Have you come across the term fiduciary duty or fiduciary obligation? What does it mean? Basically, it is a legal obligation of one party to act in the best interest of another. The obligated party is typically a fiduciary, that is, someone entrusted with the care of money or property. This is also sometimes referred to as fiduciary obligation. In the context of business, when buyers acquire goods and services for the organization or agency, he or she does so in the interest of another. In the commercial or private space, management has a duty to shareholders and use corporate resources to maximize shareholder wealth. In the government space, contracting officers use public funds, or taxpayer dollars, and thus must exercise and demonstrate good judgment so that excessive prices are not paid. This exercise of prudency and diligence is born out of the buyer's fiduciary duty. As a contracts professional, the promotion of full and open competition is highly desired. In government, be it local, state, or federal, this is mandated, although the manner and extent may vary from one jurisdiction to another. At the federal level, the Federal Acquisition Regulations 11.002A requires agencies to specify needs using market research, minimize or eliminate inclusion of restrictive provisions or conditions, and a strong, positive bias towards use of commercial and non-developmental items to the maximum extent practicable. Chapter 1 of the Guide to Contract Pricing text states that full and open competition means all responsible sources are allowed an opportunity to compete. Notice the key words here, responsible sources, as not all sources are responsible or reputable, and the operative phrase, allowed an opportunity to compete. An example of this opportunity to compete is seen through government publication of any solicitation or invitation for bids. So why would anyone be interested in selling to the government when it seems you need to compete with practically any responsible source? Here are a few reasons why. In certain commodities such as spacecraft and weapon systems, the government is the only buyer. Even if a seller wishes to turn to other consumers willing to pay a higher price like other countries, laws prohibit the sale of such items or technology. The government tends to procure in high volume quantities than individual buyers in the private sector. This becomes a major revenue source, particularly for small to medium enterprises near federal installations. Third, I once asked a supplier this question: why do they sell to the school district when I worked for the Los Angeles Unified School District? He responded that a PO from the district is as good as cash. That experience reminded me that the government pays its debts, thus lowering financial exposure or risk for sellers once they actually get a contract and perform accordingly. The last one, which is closely related to the previous reason, is the prompt payment of bills. Not only is a PO good as cash, At the federal level, there is the Prompt Payment Act, which mandates agencies to pay suppliers in 30 days after submission of a proper invoice. In the private sector, we have the flexibility to stretch out payment terms. Case in point, at Edison, our standard payment terms for our suppliers is net 60 days. We do encourage and promote paying early in exchange for prompt payment discounts. The government also has other distinct advantages in its favor when contracting. This would include obtaining most favored customer treatment. Due to the government's large volume or high dollar buying practices and prompt payment protocols, it receives special price concessions from suppliers that other commercial or private buyers cannot take advantage of. Next, the government can obtain cost and pricing data from interested suppliers bidding or negotiating a contract. This gives the government a unique perspective on how a supplier sets its selling prices based on cost elements of a product or service. The ability to obtain cost and pricing data is pursuant to the Truth in Negotiations Act, or Public Law 87-653. Private companies and individuals do not have this advantage as a legal right in private contracting. However, I would encourage you as buyers in the commercial area to make every attempt to obtain this information. As for sellers, I have seen business relationships grow and mature when the level of cost and pricing transparency is achieved. Of course, any disclosure of such sensitive information must be subject to your own company's internal controls, policies, and practices. Now let's move to price versus cost. What's the difference? Oftentimes, these terms are used interchangeably. However, it is imperative for contract managers to know the difference. One thing you need to remember is that usage is relational. That means you need to know from whose perspective you are speaking from. Let's define price for a moment. The basic formula for price is cost plus profit, or what the market will bear. Price to the government or any other buyer is the financial outlay which is made to pay for a product or service. In our basic formula, a reasonable price is the sum of reasonable costs to do the work and a reasonable profit. Price to the contractor or seller means the total payment received for work performed. It represents the sum a seller expects to receive, enough to repay it for actual costs expended to do the work or deliver the goods, plus a profit for doing the work. Now let's talk about cost. The term cost is the sum total of resources needed to produce or perform a service, excluding profit. Using the terminology we learned earlier, cost is defined as the expenses a contractor or seller will incur in performing the work. Now we've reintroduced a third term, profit, which we learned earlier as the difference between revenues and expenses. This definition aligns since expenses are essentially costs to the entity that is expending them. To keep things straight, I always keep in mind that the amount a buyer pays a seller is his or her cost, whereas the amount a seller charges a buyer is his or her price. Now that we defined price, cost, and profit, what is a fair and reasonable price? A fair and reasonable price may mean different things to different people. Although the FAR talks about payment of fair and reasonable prices, it does not define the term. In the regular course of business, sellers want to make as much money as possible as part of their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, while buyers, on the other hand, want to save as much as possible owing to their fiduciary duty to their company or agency. This creates the so-called market tension. In order to answer this question of what is a fair and reasonable price, the book offers us 5 typical means to establish a fair and reasonable price. Of the five, four are market-based and one is cost-based. Let's go through each one at a high level. I would encourage you to read Chapter 1 of the Guide to Contract Pricing in more detail. The first is through competitive offers. These prices are arrived at in response to or from bids or solicitations encouraging competing offers through full and open competition. Next is catalog price. Prices in this method are established through the publication by the seller of a regularly maintained catalog or price list. Prices are available for inspection and review of potential buyers, and state current prices including any discounts or other price-related terms. The third is market price. Here, pricing can be substantiated from sources independent of the seller. It represents the current sale prices in the normal course of trade between buyers and sellers free to bargain in the marketplace. An example of this is looking for comps when trying to buy a house. A potential buyer may look at recent home sales independent of the one being transacted to establish a market price. In some cases, as in pharmaceuticals or drugs, prices are established through legislative or regulatory authority, usually to protect buyers or punish buyers, examples of which are fines or penalties, or to achieve some socio-economic goal. At Edison, I'm very familiar with this concept since we are also a regulated entity. Our rates for electricity, or the amount we can charge our customers, is set in a rate base presided over by the State Public Utilities Commission. The last means to establish a fair and reasonable price is through the use of cost and pricing data. Here, the buyer will require the seller to provide a detailed breakdown showing the composition and basis or estimate of the total cost by direct costs, indirect costs, profit, and total price. The cost and pricing data is analyzed and serves as a basis to negotiate a fair and reasonable price. We just covered 5 different ways to establish what a fair and reasonable price is. The textbook also offers us additional concepts to take note of. The first is the idea of price analysis. This is a set of methods to determine if an asking price is reasonable without examining cost and profit included in the price. We often do this in our personal lives. For example, when you go to the grocery to get a tube of toothpaste and brand A is priced at $3 and brand B is priced at $3.50, you don't analyze how much of that price is attributable to the cost of manufacturing, packaging, labor, marketing, etc., or how much profit each company makes for a tube of toothpaste sold. Instead, you might look at the prices and compare how much toothpaste you are getting from one tube versus the other. The concept is about cost analysis. This is a set of procedures to determine reasonableness of proposed costs to do contract work. If in price analysis you take the stated prices of competing independent offers and comparing them, the inverse is true for cost analysis. Here you go deeper into the price equation and look at the underlying cost elements such as direct labor, materials, and indirect costs, plus profit, and the basis for each to determine if the price is truly fair and reasonable. Now let's tackle the concept of adequate price competition. If we go back to my earlier example about buying toothpaste and you compared brand A and to brand B, do you think it is considered adequate price competition? If we broke out this term, the word competition plays a big part. According to Wikipedia, competition is in general a contest or rivalry between two or more entities, organisms, animals, individuals, economic groups, or social groups, etc. In this case, two toothpaste brands competing for the consumer's business is an example of competition. So, When do we consider that adequate price competition exists? At the federal level, FAR 15.403-1C states that it exists when two or more responsible offerors competing independently submit offers. It also states that there must be no other finding that the price of the successful offeror is unreasonable. Equally important is that the market research points to two or more responsible offers would submit responsive offers. In other words, if before going to bid you already know from market research that there's only one source, you're probably better off exploring a sole source approach. Which is a good transition to our next concept. Single reasonable offers are allowed under FAR 15.403-1C Romanet 2, provided the buyer in preparing the solicitation anticipated multiple priced offers. Further, a certificate of independent price determination must be completed as required under FAR 3.103-1. You can also refer to FAR 52.203-2. Here, the offeror certifies prices were arrived at independently. Prices have not and will not be knowingly disclosed to any other offeror prior to bid opening time or during negotiations prior to contract award time. And last but not the least, no attempt at influencing to submit or not any offers. To recap, we learned about several basic pricing policies and concepts, including fiduciary duty, which is a legal obligation of a party to act in the best interest of another. We learned the various pricing advantages in government contracting. We talked about the difference between the terms price and cost. What is price analysis and cost analysis? We went over the concept of adequate price competition and does it exist according to the FAR. And finally, single reasonable offers and the certification required under 15.3.103-1. And this concludes our lecture for today.